You know, it takes less than a second for a pitcher to release a baseball and have it reach home plate. There are hundreds of pitches each game, thousands each day, nearly 1 million each season, and millions upon millions in the long history of Major League Baseball. But only one pitch, just one, left a batter dead. And left the pitcher who threw it unable to escape the legacy of that single half second in time. From WZVN Fort Myers, I'm Jeff Butera, and this is Killer Fastball. Indian shortstop Ray Chapman got hit in the head by Carl Mays' fastball on a Monday. Chapman died early Tuesday. His body arrived via train back in Cleveland on Wednesday. His father-in-law announced on Thursday they were moving Ray's funeral from St. Philomene's Church to St. John's Roman Catholic Church. And 2,000 people packed that church for the funeral on Friday. But let's just say this. It was not a normal service. For starters, this was like a funeral for a statesman. Chapman's in-laws had moved the service to that larger church to accommodate the swarm of people in Cleveland that wanted to be there. Even though 2,000 got in, 3,000 got turned away. And those that did make it inside, they saw something remarkable. 20,023 people in Cleveland had each donated 10 cents apiece to what they called flower from a fan. That money, those coins, paid for 2,063 flowers laid out on an enormous floral blanket. A beautiful sight. But you know who never saw it? Two of Chapman's closest friends, Indians teammate Jack Graney and Indians manager Tris Speaker. Here's team historian Jeremy Theodore.
The whole idea that, Speaker and Graney and Wabi, there's just, there's this big fight the day before the funeral, and, the guys punch each other, and then none of them even can show up to the funeral itself and be pallbearers because they have black eyes, and the drama is all there.
Mike Sowell laid out the drama in his book The Pitch That Killed. It was one of his biggest revelations. So publicly, it was announced that Graney and Speaker were too distraught to attend the funeral. Graney was so upset they said he had to be taken out to the countryside. Speaker in such bad shape, it was reported, he was having a nervous breakdown. But behind the scenes, you know what they were really doing? They were throwing punches over religion. See, Ray Chapman's in-laws were Catholic, and his wife Katie said Ray was about to convert, so they wanted a Catholic service. Ray Chapman's parents were Protestants, and they didn't. And for some reason, Chapman's teammates took sides in that whole spat. Graney was Catholic, Speaker was Protestant, and they fought over it like it was the Crusades. And because they were brawling, they were not at the funeral. Black eyes did not seem appropriate for the affair, which meant they never heard this said about another man that they probably wanted to fight, Carl Mays. At the funeral, Reverend William Scullin said, quote, "May there be no hostility in any heart to the man who was the unfortunate occasion of Ray's accident. He feels it more deeply than you, and no one regrets it as much as he. This great game we play, that is our national pastime, could not produce anyone who would willingly do a thing like that. Do not hold any animosity." To which I would say, Reverend, that's lovely, but to say no one regrets it as much as Carl Mays suggests you don't know Carl Mays very well. And to ask that there be no hostility toward him, well, good luck with that. I played baseball myself in high school. I was also my school's valedictorian. But being a smart guy on the diamond, well, it's best summed up by Kevin Costner in the movie Bull Durham.
I'm Crash Davis. I'm your new catcher, and you just got lesson number 1. Don't think. Can only hurt the ball club.
Barry Schallenberger violated rule number 1. He played baseball, he managed teams, and he thought a whole lot. So I was doing a little bit of research on you, and I know you coached at the University of Alabama, but you are also one of the most well-read, well-educated baseball coaches I could find. Tell me about your background.
Well, thanks for the compliment.
Schallenberger turned out to be pretty modest, so I'm going to tell you about his background instead. High school teacher and coach in Florida. Then he became an assistant coach at the University of Alabama. Then he took over that program in 1980 and served as head coach until 94. And he won more games with the Crimson Tide than any coach in their history except one. But he's got a doctorate, too. That's the whole thinking part. What's your doctorate in?
It's in human performance studies.
Explain that.
PE.
There were two main reasons that I wanted to talk to Dr. Schallenberger. You'll find out the second one much later in this episode, and it's a good one. But the first was this. In his playing days, Barry was a pitcher. So I was curious. If what had happened to Carl Mays, the man who threw that pitch, had happened to you as a pitcher, one of your pitches was to harm a batter in such a way, what kind of mental impact do you think that would have had on you as a pitcher?
That would have affected me a whole lot.
And it turned out that wasn't really a hypothetical. Schallenberger did hit a guy in the head during his playing days, and this was before they had decent helmets.
With a curveball, of all things, and put him in the hospital. And I really felt bad about that. I visited him, and he was fine, but that was a little scary. So I can imagine doing even worse damage. I can't even imagine what that must have felt like.
Schallenberger's reaction, it feels normal to me. Scared, worried about the guy you hit, knowing it would be on your conscience even if you didn't do it on purpose. Just very aware that something you did caused someone else serious pain. But that wasn't exactly Carl Mays.
I didn't do anything wrong, and I'm going to continue playing, and I'm going to play at the same level, and I'm going to take care of my family.
If you read Sal's book,
Extra, read all about it.
Or you read the newspaper articles in the days, weeks, and years after Chapman's deadly beating, what you'll find instead is an excuse tour. Mays blames one thing after the other. Right there on the field that day, Mays starts by blaming a rough spot on the ball. He argues that's why the pitch veered inside. Also, you remember how it was raining before that game? Mays would later blame the ball being wet for his wild pitch.
Play ball!
Then he tried to blame it on the umpires, saying they should have tossed out the wet ball with the rough spot on it. Here's the exact quote from Mays. "It was the umpire's fault. A roughened spot on the ball, sometimes even a scratch, will make a ball do queer things. Umpires are instructed to throw out balls that have been roughed." Well, that didn't go over well. The umpires released a statement in response saying, quote, "No pitcher in the American League resorted to trickery more than Carl Mays in attempting to rough a ball to get a break on it, which would make it more difficult to hit. In short, hey guy, it's not on us, so don't try it." Years later, in a rare interview, Mays even tried to blame Chapman himself for what happened. Chapman was hit, Mays suggested, because he shifted his back foot in the batter's box. Mays said when he saw that, he knew Chapman was going to try to bunt for a hit. Mays said if the pitch was low, Chapman would be able to do it. He was so fast, no one would throw him out. So Mays threw the ball high, trying to get Chapman to bunt the ball into the air. Basically, he's arguing that Chapman just ran into a high pitch that was over the plate. But here's what's interesting about all the excuses. The ball, the umpires, Chapman. When it probably made the most sense to use an excuse, Mays didn't. Remember, some people thought Mays was a murderer. And not just hyperbole, literally. They thought this was a crime.
Mays had to go down to the police department, and the district attorney had to decide whether to bring charges against him. You know, some people thought that he should be charged with murder or manslaughter.
Mays gave a statement to the assistant district attorney in New York, a guy named Joyce. Joyce was in charge of the homicide division. Mays told him, "When Chapman came to bat, I got the signal for a straight fastball, which I delivered. It was a little too close, and I saw Chapman duck his head in effort to get out of the path of the ball. He was a little too late, however, and a second later he fell to the ground. It was the most regrettable incident of my career, and I would give anything if I could undo what has happened." No excuse there. Real remorse. And the DA almost immediately decided this was a tragic accident, nothing more. Didn't even call witnesses. And he never went after Mays. but other players did.
There was, like I said, a move to run Carl Mays out of baseball.
The Cleveland News polled the Indians players. Every single one of them thought Mays had thrown at Chapman on purpose, all except their manager, Tris Speaker, who made it a point to publicly say it was an accident, and he had enough sway with his players to keep them from revolting. So it was actually two other teams in the American League that led a charge to get Mays kicked out of baseball, though it's fair to say neither of those teams was a coincidence. The first team was Mays' old team, the Red Sox, who were still salty over how he had just abruptly left that team in 1919. And the second team was the Tigers, who just flat out hated Mays. Don't forget, Ty Cobb from the Tigers was convinced Mays used to throw at him too.
Thinking was that he should not be allowed to pitch. He definitely shouldn't be allowed to pitch against the Indians.
But the baseball owners quickly crushed any plans for a players' boycott, threatening serious punishment if players refused to take the field. So they played on, even if they were furious at Mays for what he did. Instead, they left it to the baseball writers to give voice to their anger. Let me tell you about one column I found. Louis Doger wrote it in the Washington Times, and he is seething. For the good of baseball, he writes, an explosion from the players in the big leagues should drive Carl Mays and Carl Mays' methods from the game once and for all. He suggests that 3 reputable players from each team sign an affidavit saying Mays threw at them intentionally. And then he takes shots at Mays' grief, suggesting they're just crocodile tears. The baseball sob sisters have gone to work already. They paint gloomy pictures of Mays' grief, Doger writes. They did the same last winter, as they told of how Mays broke down and wept when told of the burning of his baseball trophies. Quick side note to explain that. So Mays' house in Missouri had burned down in 1919 when he was away at spring training. His baseball keepsakes, they were inside the house. And Mays took it really hard. But Doger concludes the paragraph almost sarcastically. Mays seems to be a steady weeper. And then he finishes with a flourish. Listen to this. It is for the good of baseball, he writes, that young men like Ray Chapman live their allotted span. And that didn't happen. But then again, neither did running Mays out of the game. In fact, within days, he was back on the mound to face Cobb and the Tigers. Before the game, a clubhouse boy came up and gave Mays a note, said it was from Cobb. On it was this message. If it was within my power, I would have inscribed on Ray Chapman's tombstone these words. Here lies the victim of arrogance, viciousness, and greed. But do you think it rattled Mays? Nope. He tore the paper up, went out to the mound, and threw a complete game shutout. Say what you want about his personality, but the guy had focus.
No matter what you think of Carl Mays, you have to respect how tough he was, because he went on to have a great career.
Including the rest of that ill-fated 1920 season. Mays won 6 more games after the Chapman beating. But guess what? It was not enough to propel the Yankees to the pennant. Because a team you would have assumed would crumble under the weight of the darkest tragedy in baseball history was instead about to catch fire. I want you to think for a second about your favorite team and that team's second best player. Now imagine if that player got hurt and was lost for the season, or, heaven forbid, killed in a game. Winning a championship that year ain't going to be easy under those circumstances. I mentioned before, the Cubs are my favorite team, and they won it all back in 2016. But I'm not dumb. If first baseman Anthony Rizzo, the team's second best player that year, had gotten hurt in mid-August, didn't play again, Chicago does not hoist a World Series trophy at the end of that season.
The Cubs have finally won it all! 8-7-10!
Every one of the baseball minds that I talked to for this podcast recognized that the 1920 Indians were in the exact same spot.
Things could have just fallen apart.
Indians historian Jeremy Theodore probably knows better than anyone. Chapman was Cleveland's second-best player. He was the glue that held that team together.
With Chapman's death, there was a huge hole at shortstop, and that normally would have crippled a lot of teams.
Baseball historian Gary Surdkowski recognized this could have derailed the club, really torpedoed any chance they had at a championship, and nobody would have thought the less of them.
I can think of many, many positions on the baseball field that wouldn't be as negatively affected as shortstop. I mean, that is crucial to any team.
Former University of Alabama head coach Barry Schallenberger told me, yeah, the Indians lost their second-best player, they lost a good hitter, they lost a great leader, but also don't minimize where on the diamond Chapman played.
I mean, it must have been, where do we go from here? What's plan B? Who's going to play short?
And the answer to that question is why I interviewed Schallenberger in the first place. Because the answer was a guy who used to come to Schallenberger's practices at Alabama. A little man, then in his 80s, who would sit behind the first base dugout.
He came to practice religiously. I mean, he'd be the only one in the stands. First thing he would always check out was who my shortstop was. Mm-hmm. Who you got this year, Coach, playing shortstop? And he'd tell me if he liked him or not.
It's not like he didn't have the credentials to ask about the shortstop. The little man had been a shortstop himself. And he'd also later been the head coach at Alabama. And the stadium at Alabama, the Joe, well, it was named after him too. His name was Joe Sewell.
Coach Sewell was very tiny, maybe 5'6", 5'7", maybe a little left-handed slap hitter.
Sewell had been born around the turn of the century in Alabama. And unlike Mays and Chapman, he'd been born into a white-collar, very successful family.
His dad was a doctor in a little small town just outside of Montgomery, Alabama. And his dad totally expected him to continue the family name and hang up the shingle right next to him. But Dad was devastated when he signed a pro contract instead of going to med school.
How devastated? Listen to this.
Matter of fact, Coach told me that his dad didn't talk to him for 12 years after he signed pro.
That's pretty devastated. Disappointed dad and all, Sewell went to New Orleans after graduating from Alabama, but to play ball instead of play doctor. In the Jazz capital of the country, Sewell hadn't played one full season with the New Orleans Pelicans when the Indians called that September. Hey, we need a shortstop, the Indians management said. We heard that kid Sewell can play.
To bring up a young, just graduated from college, who he never saw a big league game, let alone played in one, never went to spring training.
But he went to Cleveland on a train. He arrived during a game, sat in the dugout in his regular clothes, and he saw diving catches, and he saw an inside-the-park home run, and he saw a straight steal of home, and he saw in himself doubt.
I remember him saying, he sat there thinking, what in the world am I doing here? You know, and really doubting whether he was going to be good enough to compete at that level.
Think of it. Kid is 21, barely a year before he was playing college ball in Tuscaloosa, Alabama. Now he gets inserted into the final month of a heated American League pennant race and asked to replace Ray Chapman, a star, a legend, the only player to ever die from an injury sustained on the field. How he conquered that mentally is nothing short of remarkable, or perhaps delusional. To explain that, here's Mike Sal.
Joe Sewell imagined that when he put on the Cleveland uniform, he would be Ray Chapman reincarnated.
Don't laugh. It worked. Over the next 22 games, Sewell hit .329. He drove in 12 runs. He scored 14. Rookie jitters? No.
Ray gets replaced with Joey Sewell, who is arguably one of our greatest hitters. Then he had a season where he struck out 4 times.
In fact, as Indians historian Jeremy Theodore points out, Sewell struck out just 4 times in 3 different seasons where he had 600 at-bats. That's fewer than 1 strikeout every 150 times at the plate. For comparison's sake, one of my favorite players, Cubs shortstop Javier Baez, struck out 167 times in 2018 alone. Almost once every 4 times he came to bat. And that was a year that Baez finished second in the MVP voting. He was good that year. But when it came to not striking out, Sewell was better than great. The hardest man to strike out in Major League Baseball history.
Didn't have a lot of power, but never struck out.
Bottom line, even if you don't know much about baseball, the Indians had tragically lost one of their stars when Chapman died, but somehow managed to replace him by plucking a kid out of New Orleans who would go on to be a Hall of Famer. Although that first season, Sewell struggled to fit in with his teammates. He admitted as much to Schallenberger.
And he said it was awkward at times. They needed him, but yet he was kind of the interloper coming to fill that spot. And those teammates thought so much of Chapman.
They thought a lot more of Sewell, though, when he helped the Indians win the American League pennant. The team wound up beating the White Sox by 2 games in the standings. Mays and the Yankees flailed and faded, finishing 3 games behind Cleveland. Then the team popped champagne, winning the club's first ever World Series, defeating Brooklyn. They've only won 1 more in the 100 years since. But that year, that roller coaster year of 1920, they had triumph to go with their tragedy. The city of Cleveland threw the team a parade when they got back from Brooklyn. The fans had badly wanted a winner, and now they had it. Ray Chapman had badly wanted to leave baseball a winner, yet he wasn't there for it. He had only come back for that one last season, that one last shot at a World Series, before entering a new life with the new wife, the new baby, the new job. The 1920 World Series championship he wanted actually happened, and Chapman wasn't there to enjoy it. The new baby was born the following February, and Chapman wasn't there to see it. The future he dreamed of was waiting, and Chapman wasn't there to live it. One pitch out of millions, and it had shattered everything. Little did he know, it would also curse his family. That's next time on Killer Fastball. Killer Fastball comes to you from Waterman Broadcasting in Fort Myers, Florida. It's hosted by me, WZVN news anchor Jeff Butera. It's produced by Abigail Meyer, edited by Scott Riley, with additional voice work by Greg Parker.